The desert wind carried the scent of aviation fuel and something else, something that made Colonel Marcus Vega's hand freeze halfway to his coffee cup. Through the reinforced glass of the command center, he watched a lone figure stride across the tarmac toward the A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign, Warthog 7. The pilot moved with a peculiar gait, favoring her left leg just slightly, but her shoulders remained squared against the morning sun bleeding orange across the Syrian landscape. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez followed his commander's gaze. "That's Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Nakamura. She's actually going up." Vega didn't answer immediately. His mind raced back 18 months to a classified briefing room in Langley, where a Pentagon analyst had slid a thin manila folder across the mahogany table. Inside, 3 satellite images of a bombed-out compound in the Zagros Mountains, a single survivor's testimony, and a name that had become whispered legend among close air support units across 3 theaters of operation. The mystery wasn't what happened that day in the mountains. The mystery was how she'd survived it. Nakamura reached the aircraft, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder, flight gloves already on. The ground crew, seasoned mechanics who'd seen everything from rookie panic to veteran bravado, stood a respectful distance back. They'd heard the stories too, about Bootcamp, where drill instructors had nicknamed her Crash after she'd face-planted during the obstacle course on day 3. About flight school, where her instructors had quietly suggested she consider transport aircraft instead of fighters. About the deployment to Afghanistan, where she'd earned her wings in something else, something that changed her call sign from the mockery of Crash to the reverence of Ghost. But none of them knew about the mountains. None of them knew about the 37 hours she'd spent behind enemy lines with a shattered radio, a dislocated shoulder, and a wounded Marine sergeant named Torres who'd bled out in her arms while she whispered promises about his daughter's quinceanera. The A-10's twin General Electric turbofans began their throaty whine as Nakamura completed her pre-flight check. Vega watched her hands move across the aircraft with the fluid precision of a pianist, each gesture economical, purposeful. She paused only once, her palm flat against the nose art, a faded decal of wings wrapped around a broken chain. "Sir, the mission profile shows her flying solo into the Euphrates corridor," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with concern. "Intelligence indicates heavy SAM concentrations. Shouldn't we assign a wingman?" Vega finally lifted his coffee cup, though his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. He knew what Rodriguez didn't, that sometimes legends weren't born from company, but from the terrible solitude of doing what others couldn't. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the promise of thunder. Captain Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the ready room window, watching the lone A-10 taxi toward the active runway. Around her, pilots from 3 different squadrons had gathered, their usual morning banter replaced by an unusual reverence. The Warthog's nose pointed east, toward a horizon that shimmered with heat and danger. "You ever seen her fly?" asked Major Thompson, a veteran of 200 combat sorties who rarely showed interest in anyone else's missions. "Once," Vasquez replied, remembering a training exercise over Nevada where she'd watched Nakamura thread an A-10 through a canyon at 300 feet, delivering simulated ordnance with surgical precision, while enemy radar painted the sky around her. "She flies like the aircraft is an extension of her soul." What none of them knew was that Nakamura's relationship with flying had been forged in trauma, not triumph. At Lackland Air Force Base, she'd been the recruit who couldn't make it over the 8-foot wall, who'd fumbled her weapon during drill, who'd earned kitchen duty more often than praise. The other recruits had snickered when she'd announced her intention to pursue pilot training. Even her own training instructor, Master Sergeant Patricia Wells, had pulled her aside after the 4th week. "Listen, Nakamura," Wells had said, not unkindly, "maybe consider intelligence or logistics. Flying isn't for everyone." But there had been something in the young airman's eyes, a quiet determination that burned like banked coals. She'd returned to that 8-foot wall every evening after chow, launching herself at it until her palms bled and her shoulders screamed. She'd practiced weapons assembly in her bunk while her bunkmates slept. Most importantly, she'd never let the laughter dim that internal fire. The transformation hadn't been immediate or dramatic. It had been gradual, like water wearing stone. By graduation, she wasn't the fastest or strongest, but she developed something more valuable, an unshakable resolve that would later serve her in cockpits above hostile territory. Now, as the A-10's engine spooled up to full power, that same resolve was evident in every control input. The aircraft held short of the runway while Nakamura ran through her final checks, her voice calm and professional over the radio frequency. Tower Ghost 7, ready for departure. Ghost 7 Tower, you're cleared for takeoff. Winds 270 at 15, gusting to 22. Fly safe out there. The pause before her response lasted only seconds, but to those listening, it carried the weight of unspoken history. When she finally keyed the microphone, her voice held something that made seasoned aviators lean closer to their radios. Copy all tower, Ghost 7 rolling. The runway stretched ahead like a river of possibility and peril. The A-10 Thunderbolt II accelerated down the runway with the determined growl of twin turbofans, pushing 11,000 pounds of armored aircraft into the desert sky. From the tower, Air Traffic Controller Senior Airman James Park watched the ungainly warbird lift off, its distinctive silhouette etched against the morning sun like a prehistoric predator given wings. What made this departure different wasn't the aircraft. The A-10 had been flying close air support missions for over 4 decades. It wasn't even the destination, though the intelligence briefing had painted the Euphrates corridor in shades of amber and red threat levels. What made this different was the pilot, and the story that followed her like a shadow. Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Nakamura had earned her wings at Columbus Air Force Base on a gray October day when the instructors had privately wagered she wouldn't make it through the T6 phase. Her flight partner, a cocky Academy graduate named David Chen, had openly questioned why the Air Force was wasting resources on someone who'd barely scraped through basic training. She flies like she's fighting the aircraft, he'd told their instructor, Major Patricia Santos, after a particularly challenging formation flight. No feel for it, all mechanics, no art. Santos had nodded thoughtfully, but privately disagreed. She'd noticed something in Nakamura's approach that Chen, for all his natural talent, had missed. Where he relied on instinct and bravado, Nakamura studied every system, memorized every procedure, anticipated every failure mode. She flew with the methodical precision of someone who understood that in aviation, overconfidence killed more pilots than lack of skill. The revelation had come during an emergency procedures simulation. The computer-controlled trainer had thrown multiple system failures at the student pilots: engine fire, hydraulic failure, navigation system malfunction. Chen had responded with textbook inputs, but had grown flustered when the cascading failures overwhelmed his ability to prioritize. His simulated aircraft had crashed into a virtual mountainside. Nakamura had faced the same scenario with mechanical calm. Engine fire, mixture cutoff, fuel shutoff, fire extinguisher, hydraulic failure, manual reversion, adjusted control inputs, navigation failure, pilotage and dead reckoning. Her simulated aircraft had limped home to a perfect emergency landing. "Congratulations," Santos had said afterward, addressing the entire class but looking directly at Nakamura. "You've just learned the difference between being a pilot and being an aviator." Now, climbing through 8,000 feet over the Iraqi desert, that lesson seemed prophetic. The A-10's cockpit was Nakamura's cathedral, its instruments and displays her scripture. She cross-checked airspeed, altitude, and heading with the smooth efficiency of long practice, her hands moving across switches and controls with ballet-like precision. AWACS Ghost 7, passing flight level 100, on course for Area Bravo. Ghost 7 AWACS, Radar contact. Be advised, weather ahead shows scattered thunderstorms with tops at 25,000. Recommend deviation left of course for smoother ride. She considered the recommendation while studying her tactical display. Weather could provide concealment, but it could also hide threats. The morning briefing had been unusually tense, dominated by intelligence reports of increased surface-to-air missile activity in her target area. A company of Marines was pinned down near a village whose name she couldn't pronounce, calling for close air support against dug-in enemy positions. Standard mission profile, except for the intelligence annotation that made everyone in the briefing room shift uncomfortably. High probability of advanced air defense systems. Recommend minimum exposure time over target. Translation: get in fast, hit hard, get out. Don't linger. Don't be a hero. Don't end up as another casualty statistic in a war that seemed to generate more questions than answers. But as the A-10 banked east toward the rising sun, Nakamura carried with her the memory of another briefing, in another desert, where similar warnings had preceded the mission that changed everything. The mission that transformed her from crash to ghost. The transition had cost her more than just a call sign. It had cost her innocence, certainty, and a piece of her soul she'd never recovered. But it had also revealed something fundamental about her character, something her boot camp tormentors and flight school doubters had never suspected. She could endure what others couldn't. She could carry what others wouldn't. And when the moment came to choose between safety and sacrifice, she would always choose the harder path. The morning sun painted the cockpit in shades of gold and amber as Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura guided her A-10 deeper into hostile airspace. Behind her, the forward operating base shrank to a dot on the endless canvas of desert, while ahead lay the Euphrates corridor, and whatever waited in the maze of villages and irrigation canals that satellite imagery had revealed. Her call sign, Ghost, hadn't come from any supernatural ability to evade enemy fire, though the legend makers preferred that explanation. The truth was both simpler and more profound. She'd earned it during her third deployment to Afghanistan, during a mission that had gone sideways in ways the after-action reports could never fully capture. The original plan had been routine: close air support for a special operations team extracting a high-value target from a Taliban compound. Intelligence had been solid, weather was clear, and Nakamura had been flying with her regular wingman, Captain Jennifer "Torch" Rodriguez. 2 A-10s, maximum firepower, minimum time on target. But the intelligence had been wrong. Instead of a lightly defended compound, they'd found a heavily fortified position bristling with anti-aircraft weapons. Torch had taken a direct hit from a shoulder-fired missile during their first gun run, her A-10 erupting in flames before spinning into the mountainside in a fireball that painted the dawn sky orange and black. The ground team had been surrounded, their extraction helicopter damaged and forced to abort. Nakamura had found herself alone above the valley, watching muzzle flashes wink at her from concealed positions, while American voices crackled over the emergency frequency, reporting wounded and running low on ammunition. Protocol dictated that she call for additional support and maintain safe standoff distance. The voice of reason, represented by the AWACS controller orbiting safely at 30,000 feet, had advised exactly that. Ghost 7, recommend you egress area and wait for additional assets. Instead, she had done something that still made tactical instructors shake their heads in disbelief. She had descended to minimum altitude and begun a series of gun runs that lasted nearly 40 minutes, threading her aircraft between ridgelines while enemy fire erupted around her like deadly fireworks. The A-10's titanium bathtub had absorbed hit after hit, but she had kept pressing the attack, each strafing run delivered with surgical precision. When she'd finally exhausted her ammunition and fuel reserves, 12 American servicemen were walking out of that valley alive. The Taliban position had been obliterated, reduced to smoking craters and twisted metal. But the cost had been visible in the photographs taken after her landing. An A-10, so riddled with holes that ground crews had counted over 200 separate impacts. "How the hell are you alive?" her squadron commander had asked, staring at the battle-damaged aircraft. Nakamura's answer had become part of squadron lore. "Sometimes you just have to accept that you're already dead, sir. Once you do that, fear becomes irrelevant." Now, approaching the initial point for today's mission, she found herself drawing on that same philosophical acceptance. The tactical display showed her lone aircraft advancing toward a target area painted in various shades of threat assessment. Red zones indicated confirmed surface-to-air missile sites. Yellow zones suggested probable air defense positions. Green zones were supposedly clear, though experience had taught her that intelligence was often optimistic. "Ghost 7, this is Groundhog 6, the radio crackled with the voice of the ground controller embedded with the Marines she was supporting. "We have you on station. Current situation: enemy forces have established fighting positions along the ridge line, approximately 300 meters north of our position. They've got us pinned down with accurate sniper fire and what appears to be crew-served weapons." Nakamura banked the A-10 into a wide orbit, studying the terrain through her targeting pod. The ridge line was exactly where intelligence had predicted, but the vegetation was thicker than expected, providing excellent concealment for defending forces. More troubling were the geometric patterns she spotted in the underbrush, rectangular shapes that suggested prepared positions rather than hasty fighting holes. "Groundhog 6, Ghost 7. I'm seeing prepared defensive positions along the ridge. This looks like more than the opportunistic force we were briefed for. Are you taking indirect fire as well?" "Affirmative, Ghost 7. Mortar fire has been sporadic but accurate. We've got 3 wounded and are running low on ammunition for the Ma-Deuce." The situation was escalating beyond the original mission parameters, but Nakamura had learned long ago that the enemy rarely consulted American tactical plans before deciding how to fight. She keyed her microphone while adjusting her attack heading, lining up for a reconnaissance pass that would give her a better understanding of what the Marines were facing. Below, in positions she couldn't yet see, eyes tracked her aircraft's movement. Fingers tightened on triggers, and radio frequencies buzzed with urgent Arabic conversations, coordinating the defense against the lone American warbird circling above like a mechanical bird of prey. The A-10 descended through 6,000 feet as Nakamura began her initial reconnaissance pass, the aircraft's nose-mounted targeting pod automatically adjusting its focus to provide the clearest possible view of the terrain below. What she saw through the high-resolution optics made her unconsciously tighten her grip on the flight controls. The ridgeline bristled with carefully concealed fighting positions, their geometric precision indicating weeks of preparation rather than the hasty defensive positions intelligence had suggested. Worse, the thermal imagery revealed the distinctive heat signatures of heavy weapons, possibly .50 caliber machine guns, or even anti-aircraft cannons positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. "Groundhog 6, Ghost 7. I'm seeing a reinforced company-sized element in prepared positions. This isn't the squad-level harassment we were briefed for. Request you confirm your ammunition and casualty status." The response came quickly, tinged with the controlled tension of Marines under fire. "Ghost 7, we've got 4 wounded now, 2 urgent surgical. Ammunition is down to maybe 20%. We need those positions neutralized and we need it now." Nakamura processed the tactical situation with the methodical precision that had carried her through flight school and 3 combat deployments. The Marines needed immediate fire support, but the enemy positions were well-sighted and heavily defended. A conventional attack profile would expose her aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple directions. She thought of Captain Rodriguez, Torch, and the fireball that had marked the end of a promising career and a good friend. She thought of the boot camp instructors who had doubted her capabilities, and the flight school classmates who had openly questioned her presence in the cockpit of a combat aircraft. But mostly, she thought of the Marines below, probably kids barely out of high school, counting on her to get them home. Groundhog 6, Ghost 7. I'm going to make a gun run from the south, try to suppress the positions on the eastern end of the ridge. Keep your heads down. Copy Ghost 7. We'll mark our position with smoke. The A-10 banked hard left as Nakamura positioned for her attack run, the aircraft's airframe groaning under the G-forces, but responding with the solid reliability that had made the Thunderbolt II legendary among ground forces. She armed the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, its 7 rotating barrels capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate that could saw through armored vehicles like a chainsaw through plywood. But as she rolled into the attack dive, her radar warning receiver began painting threat symbols across her heads-up display. Surface-to-air missile sites were coming active, their search radars reaching out like electronic fingers, trying to lock onto her aircraft. The tactical display showed at least 3 distinct SAM sites, positioned in a triangle that would make evasion extremely difficult. This was the moment that separated good pilots from great ones and great pilots from legends. The smart move was to abort the attack, climb to safety, and call for additional support. Electronic warfare aircraft could suppress the SAM sites, fighter escorts could provide protection, and overwhelming force could eventually neutralize the threat. But the Marines below didn't have time for overwhelming force. They had perhaps minutes before being overrun, and their survival depended on the actions of one pilot in one aircraft carrying enough firepower to change the tactical balance. Nakamura made her choice with the same calm deliberation she'd shown during that emergency procedures simulation years ago. She pushed the A-10's nose down, diving toward the ridge line at an angle that would maximize her gun run duration while minimizing her exposure to the SAM sites. The aircraft accelerated through 400 knots as she lined up on the first set of enemy positions. Groundhog 6, Ghost 7, guns inbound from the south, danger close, keep your people down. Her finger found the trigger, and 30mm depleted uranium rounds began chewing through the enemy positions at 70 rounds per second, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through concrete and steel. The A-10 shuddered from the recoil of its own cannon, but Nakamura held the trigger down as she walked the gunfire across the ridge line, watching enemy positions disappear in clouds of dust and debris. Then her radar warning receiver screamed an urgent alarm that every combat pilot dreaded. Missile launch! Missile launch! The first surface-to-air missile rose from its concealed launcher like a telephone pole trailing white smoke, its seeker head already locked onto the heat signature of the A-10's twin turbofans. Nakamura had perhaps 3 seconds to react before 11 pounds of high explosive ended her career and her life in a very final way. Training took over where conscious thought might have failed. Nakamura simultaneously chopped the throttles, rolled inverted, and deployed chaff and flares in a defensive pattern that turned the sky behind her A-10 into a constellation of burning aluminum and pyrotechnic decoys. The aircraft's radar warning receiver continued its urgent wailing as she pulled the nose toward the deck, trading altitude for the precious seconds that might allow her to evade the incoming missile. The SA-24 surface-to-air missile had been designed specifically to counter low-flying attack aircraft like the A-10. Its advanced seeker head, capable of distinguishing between actual aircraft signatures and most conventional countermeasures. But the Warthog's designers had anticipated this threat, building the aircraft around a titanium bathtub that could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. The missile detonated 50 meters behind the A-10's tail, its proximity fuse triggered by the aircraft's radar signature. Shrapnel peppered the rear fuselage and left engine, causing immediate warnings to cascade across Nakamura's instrument panel. Engine fire warning lights illuminated like Christmas decorations, hydraulic pressure dropped toward zero, and the aircraft's flight controls developed a heavy, sluggish feel that indicated significant damage to primary systems. "Ghost 7 taking SAM hit," she transmitted, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the emergency. "Left engine on fire, hydraulic failure, continuing the mission." "Ghost 7, Groundhog 6, we see the smoke from your aircraft. Are you able to continue?" Below, Marine Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres watched the damaged A-10 trailing black smoke as it climbed away from the ridge line, its cannon fire having devastated the enemy positions that had held his squad pinned down for over an hour. Torres was a 15-year veteran who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, but he had never seen a pilot press an attack after taking missile damage. The answer to his unspoken question came seconds later as the A-10 banked around for another gun run, this time approaching from the west to engage the remaining enemy positions. Nakamura had shut down the damaged engine and transferred to manual reversion for flight control, but the aircraft remained flyable despite trailing a plume of smoke that could be seen for miles. "Groundhog 6, Ghost 7, I've still got ammunition and one good engine. We're not done yet." What the Marines below couldn't see was the instrument panel that looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights, or the control stick that now required constant pressure to maintain level flight. The A-10 was flying on mechanical backups and pilot determination, its sophisticated systems reduced to the fundamental principles of lift, thrust, and the pilot's ability to maintain control through pure muscle and will. Nakamura lined up for her second gun run, knowing that the remaining SAM sites would be tracking her damaged aircraft and calculating intercept solutions. The tactical display showed at least 2 more missile sites with active search radars, their operators undoubtedly emboldened by the success of the first engagement. But something had changed during that first missile hit, something that transcended tactical considerations and entered the realm of personal commitment. This was no longer just a close air support mission. It had become a test of everything she had learned about flying, fighting, and the thin line between acceptable risk and necessary sacrifice. She pressed the attack with methodical precision, her second gun run devastating another cluster of enemy positions, while her damaged aircraft shook and bucked from the aerodynamic disruption caused by battle damage. The A-10's designers had built redundancy into every critical system, and that redundancy was now being tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "Direct hits on target," came the excited voice of the ground controller. "Ghost 7, you're walking those rounds right through their positions. Outstanding shooting." But even as enemy positions disappeared under the impact of 30mm cannon fire, Nakamura's tactical situation continued to deteriorate. Her radar warning receiver painted new threats across the display, mobile SAM launchers repositioning to engage her damaged aircraft from different vectors. The enemy had learned from the first engagement and was adapting their tactics in real time. The question was no longer whether she could complete the mission, but whether she could survive long enough to get the Marines out of immediate danger. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered the same words she had spoken after that legendary mission in Afghanistan. "Sometimes you just have to accept that you're already dead." But accepting death and embracing it were different things entirely, and Kestrel Nakamura had never been one to go gentle into any night. The second missile launch came from a position Nakamura hadn't detected, a mobile launcher that had remained silent during her previous passes before revealing itself at the moment of maximum tactical advantage. The SA-18 lifted off its rail with the characteristic white smoke trail that every attack pilot recognized as the harbinger of very bad news. This time, however, the missile's approach vector was different, coming from her 11 o'clock position rather than directly behind, which limited her defensive options considerably. Chaff and flares might confuse the seeker head, but the missile's trajectory would carry it directly through her flight path regardless of evasive maneuvering. "Second missile launch," she transmitted, while simultaneously executing a defensive spiral that pushed the damaged A-10 to its structural limits. The aircraft protested with groans and vibrations that could be felt through the flight controls, but it responded to her inputs with the stubborn reliability that had made the Thunderbolt II beloved by pilots and ground forces alike. The missile detonated close enough to spiderweb the cockpit canopy and send shrapnel through the right wing, but far enough away to avoid catastrophic damage. More warning lights illuminated on the instrument panel, and the aircraft's handling became increasingly unpredictable as damage accumulated in systems that had already been operating beyond their design parameters. "Ghost 7, your aircraft is trailing significant smoke," came the concerned voice of the ground controller. "Recommend you egress the area for emergency landing." From her position at 800 feet above the battlefield, Nakamura could see the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. The Marines below had used her gun runs to reposition and consolidate their defensive perimeter, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Enemy reinforcements were visible along the northern approach routes, vehicles that looked suspiciously like technical trucks mounting heavy weapons. More critically, she could see muzzle flashes from positions she hadn't yet engaged, indicating that the enemy force was larger and more dispersed than intelligence had indicated. A partial strike would leave the Marines vulnerable to counterattack once her damaged aircraft departed the area. Negative Groundhog 6. I still have ammunition and targets. We finish this now. The decision violated every principle of tactical aviation taught in flight school and refined through years of combat experience. Damaged aircraft should egress the battle area immediately. Pilots should not continue attacking when their aircraft were compromised. Risk should be minimized, not embraced with both arms and a grim smile. But Kestrel Nakamura had learned something during her years of military service that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulators. Sometimes the textbook answer wasn't the right answer. Sometimes the most important victories came from rejecting conventional wisdom and doing what needed to be done regardless of personal cost. She rolled the battered A-10 into her third attack run, this time targeting the vehicle concentration to the north. The aircraft responded sluggishly, its flight characteristics degraded by accumulated battle damage, but it still carried enough firepower to change the tactical equation on the ground. The GAU-8 cannon had been designed to destroy Soviet tanks during a theoretical World War III that never came. Against unarmored vehicles and personnel in fighting positions, its effect was devastating. Nakamura's gun run walked 30mm rounds through the enemy vehicle park, each impact sending shockwaves through the ground that could be felt by the Marines over a kilometer away. But the enemy wasn't finished either. As she climbed away from the target area, her radar warning receiver detected a new threat, a shoulder-fired missile launched from close range, its infrared seeker already locked onto her damaged left engine. The missile had been fired from directly below, making evasive action nearly impossible in an aircraft already operating at the edge of its performance envelope. This time, there would be no near miss. The missile detonated against the A-10's left engine nacelle in a fireball that could be seen for miles, tearing away control surfaces and severing hydraulic lines that were already operating on backup systems. The aircraft rolled hard right and began an uncontrolled descent toward the desert floor. "Ghost 7 hit, Ghost 7 hit." The transmission came from Groundhog 6, whose Marines were now watching the smoking A-10 spiral toward Earth, trailing debris and burning fuel. But even as the aircraft fell, Nakamura fought for control with the determination that had carried her from bootcamp ridicule to combat legend. The A-10 might be dying, but it wasn't dead yet, and neither was she. The ground rushed up at Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura with the inevitability of mathematics and physics, but her hands never stopped working the controls. The A-10 had lost primary hydraulics, backup hydraulics, and most of its left wing control surfaces, but it still responded to manual inputs through cables and pulleys that represented 1970s engineering at its most robust. She managed to arrest the spiral and achieve something resembling controlled flight, though at a rapidly decreasing altitude that left her with limited options. The aircraft was descending at nearly 2,000 feet per minute despite her best efforts, which gave her perhaps 90 seconds before impact with the desert floor. "Ghost 7, we have emergency vehicles standing by," came the voice of the tower controller at her home base, monitoring the emergency frequency. "State your intentions." Intentions. The word would have been funny if the situation hadn't been so dire. Her intentions were to survive the next 2 minutes, find a patch of relatively smooth desert, and execute a crash landing that left her in condition to walk away from the wreckage. Beyond that, intentions became increasingly theoretical. But as she fought to maintain control of the dying aircraft, her eyes found the tactical display one final time. The enemy vehicle concentration had been neutralized, and the prepared positions along the ridge line were no longer factors in the tactical equation. Below, the Marines were already beginning to move, taking advantage of her sacrifice to extract from their exposed position. The mission had been accomplished, but at a cost that tactical manuals would classify as acceptable losses in the sterile language of after-action reports. One aircraft destroyed, one pilot potentially killed or wounded in exchange for the successful extraction of a surrounded ground unit. The mathematics of war suggested it was a favorable trade. Nakamura disagreed with the mathematics. She had no intention of becoming a favorable trade or an acceptable loss. The A-10 might be mortally wounded, but she had trained for exactly this scenario during countless hours in flight simulators and emergency procedures practice. Aircraft could be replaced. Pilots were irreplaceable, especially pilots with her experience and hard-won knowledge. At 500 feet above the desert, she began executing the emergency procedures that might allow her to survive the impact. Emergency power to essential systems. Harness tight, seat back upright, helmet secure. Emergency locator beacon activated. Personal survival equipment inventoried and secured. But even as she prepared for the crash, part of her mind remained focused on the tactical situation below. The Marines were moving, but enemy reinforcements might still arrive before they reached their extraction point. Her damaged aircraft might no longer be capable of providing fire support, but it still contained over 1,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition and several air-to-ground missiles that could be decisive if properly employed. The idea that formed in her mind would have been dismissed as impossible by anyone with a rational understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft performance. But rationality had never been Kestrel Nakamura's strongest characteristic. Stubbornness, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat had carried her much further than rational analysis ever could. At 300 feet above the desert, she made a decision that would be studied in military academies for decades and debated in pilot bars until the end of time. Instead of attempting a survivable crash landing, she pointed the A-10's nose at the remaining enemy positions and committed to one final attack run. The aircraft dove toward the Earth with the terminal velocity of a guided missile, its pilot using gravity and momentum as weapons when conventional tactics had been exhausted. The GAU-8 cannon fired continuously as she descended, sending nearly 400 rounds of depleted uranium into enemy positions in the span of 15 seconds. The impact, when it came, was visible from the Marine position as a fireball that rose above the desert floor like a miniature sunrise. But the explosion came from enemy positions, not from the wreckage of an American aircraft. In the final seconds before impact, Nakamura had managed to punch out of the cockpit, her ejection seat carrying her clear of the fireball that consumed both her aircraft and the last organized enemy resistance in the area. She hit the desert floor hard, her parachute barely having time to deploy fully, but she hit it alive and conscious. Above her, the plume of smoke from her final attack marked the end of one phase of her legend and the beginning of another. The rescue took 6 hours, during which Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Nakamura provided ground control for the Marine extraction from her position in a shallow wadi 3 kilometers from the crash site. Her survival radio had been damaged during ejection, but her backup beacon was functioning, and she had retained enough situational awareness to guide the rescue helicopters to her position while avoiding areas of residual enemy activity. When the HH-60 Pave Hawk finally lifted her from the desert, she was dehydrated, concussed, and sporting a dislocated shoulder from the ejection sequence. But she was conscious and coherent enough to provide a detailed debrief to the intelligence officers who met her aircraft at the medical facility. Enemy strength was significantly underestimated, she reported from her hospital bed, her left arm in a sling but her voice steady. Recommend updating intelligence assessments for similar operations in this area. Also recommend additional close air support assets for future missions of this type. What she didn't report, and what never appeared in the official after-action report, was the moment during her descent when she had made the conscious decision to sacrifice her aircraft and risk her life for a tactical advantage that couldn't be quantified in conventional terms. The mathematics of war might have suggested that her survival was more valuable than the destruction of a few additional enemy positions, but she had made a different calculation. The Marines had extracted successfully with 0 additional casualties. The enemy force in the area had been effectively neutralized. Most importantly, the legend of Ghost 7 had evolved from a story of survival under fire to something approaching myth. A pilot who had literally crashed her aircraft into the enemy rather than accept tactical defeat. Word of the mission spread through military channels with the speed of digital communication and the embellishment that accompanied all good war stories. By the time Nakamura was released from medical care 2 weeks later, pilots throughout the theater were discussing her final attack run, with the reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients or aviation pioneers. She pointed that hog straight down and rode it into the ground, became the standard version, usually accompanied by knowing nods and the kind of respect that combat pilots reserved for actions they understood but knew they couldn't replicate. The reality was both simpler and more complex. Nakamura had made a series of tactical decisions based on her assessment of the situation, her evaluation of her aircraft's capabilities, and her understanding of what was required to accomplish the mission. She had accepted risk because the alternative was accepting failure, and failure meant Marines would die. But the legend that grew around her final